This statue may look like a symbol of Rome's greatness, but it's not what you think, because behind the shining marble and golden crowns lies one of the darkest stories in human history, the reign of Caligula, the mad Roman emperor whose desires turned the empire into a nightmare. The year was 37 AD, and Rome celebrated a new ruler, believing peace had finally returned. Streets filled with laughter, temples filled with prayers, and citizens whispered of hope after years of tyranny. But they were wrong. What seemed like salvation would soon reveal a monster. At first, Caligula was loved. People cried tears of joy when he became emperor. They thought he would restore Rome's glory and kindness. But within months, the mask fell. His charm turned into cruelty, his laughter into madness. Whispers of his behavior began spreading through the city, not as rumors, but as truth. Senators trembled in silence, families locked their doors, and even soldiers avoided his gaze. This was not the Rome of courage and honor anymore. This was an empire sinking into fear and humiliation. If Caligula's hunger for power had been stopped early, Rome might have survived with its soul intact, but it wasn't. And because no one dared to speak against him, his desires became law. What began as whispers turned into screams echoing through the marble halls of the palace. The emperor's appetite for control knew no limits. He believed that to possess someone's body was to own their spirit. No family, no woman, no god was safe from his reach. The empire that had once conquered nations now bowed before one man's corruption. Every choice Caligula made pulled Rome deeper into despair. Senators lost their dignity, noble women lost their names, and the people lost their faith in the gods. The city that once stood as the heart of civilization began to rot from within. Fear ruled the streets, and silence became Rome's only defense. Because if anyone dared to question Caligula, they vanished. If anyone resisted, their families paid the price. This was the true cost of unchecked power, an empire that forgot its own strength, enslaved by one man's madness. Caligula's Rome became a warning carved in history, a reminder that when hunger for pleasure and domination goes unchallenged, even the greatest civilization can crumble from the inside. Caligula's story began not in the shadows, but under the brightest lights of Rome's glory. He was born into greatness, a child of the imperial family, surrounded by power, wealth, and admiration. His father, Germanicus, was one of Rome's most beloved generals, honored for his victories and adored by the legions. Even as a boy, Caligula followed his father to the battlefield, dressed in a tiny soldier's uniform. The soldiers laughed affectionately and called him Caligula, meaning little boots. At that time, the name was a sign of love, not madness. From the moment he entered the world, the empire treated him like a gift from the gods. Statues were raised in his family's honor, poets praised their bloodline, and the people whispered that young Caligula might one day restore the greatness of Rome. When the harsh and cruel Tiberius ruled the empire, many secretly hoped that Caligula would bring back the warmth and mercy that Rome had lost. He was charming, polite, and clever. He said the right words and played the role of the dutiful heir perfectly. Behind his soft smile, though, something darker was forming. When Tiberius died, Rome celebrated. The streets filled with music and flowers as crowds shouted Caligula's name. They believed a new golden age had begun. Senators bowed eagerly. Families prayed in gratitude. And every citizen thought the nightmare of tyranny was finally over. For the first few months, Caligula appeared to prove them right. He freed prisoners, paid debts, and even held lavish games to honor the people. Rome had not seen such happiness in years, but happiness under his rule was only the calm before the storm. Because power changes people, and absolute power devours them. Slowly, the young emperor began to reveal his true nature. The boy who once wore a soldier's boots became a man who walked on the hearts of his people. His laughter turned cold. His generosity became a weapon, and his desire for control grew without limit. The same citizens who once shouted his name began to whisper it in fear. That child once loved by the legions would soon command Rome's power, not to defend its borders or protect its people, but to destroy everything that made it great. Caligula's rise was not a triumph. It was the beginning of Rome's descent into madness. The joy that once filled Rome quickly began to fade. The emperor who had promised mercy and glory turned into something unrecognizable. Caligula no longer smiled for his people. He laughed at them. His first acts of kindness were replaced by acts of cruelty that made even the bravest soldiers tremble. He began testing how far his power could reach and how much pain he could cause before anyone dared to stop him. The same senators who had once praised him now lived in fear of his next command. The same citizens who had worshipped him now prayed he would forget their names. At first, the changes seemed strange but harmless. Caligula demanded that temples be built in his honor. He ordered statues of himself dressed as gods. People laughed nervously, unsure whether he was serious. But soon, laughter was no longer safe. His words became law, and his madness became Rome's new religion. Those who hesitated to praise him were punished. Those who refused to bow were never seen again. Power no longer satisfied him. He wanted worship. He wanted the kind of devotion only the gods received, and he was willing to destroy anyone who denied it. Were you aware that Caligula forced senators to watch as he humiliated their wives? He would summon noble women to his private chambers and return hours later, mocking them in front of their husbands. He spoke openly of what he had done, laughing, as the senators bowed in silence, pretending not to hear. To speak was death. To stay silent was agony. Rome's rulers, once proud and noble, had become helpless actors in his cruel games. His cruelty soon turned into theater. Public banquets became stages of humiliation. At feasts, he pointed to any woman who caught his eye and ordered her to follow him. The music never stopped. The crowd pretended nothing was wrong. And when he returned, he ridiculed her, describing every detail while her husband sat frozen beside him. What had once been Rome's finest gatherings became displays of degradation and fear. Were you aware that Caligula demanded people worship him as a living god? He walked into temples, claiming to be Jupiter himself. He even replaced the heads of statues of the gods with his own face. Priests who had served for decades were forced to bow before him and offer prayers as if he were divine. For Caligula, this was not faith, it was dominance. He wanted to prove that no power, not even that of the gods, could rival his own. The line between ruler and monster vanished completely. His laughter echoed through the palace halls as men and women wept outside its doors. Rome had given him absolute power, and he used it to strip away dignity, faith, and humanity itself. What began as madness became ritual. Every act of humiliation, every scream, every whisper of terror fed his hunger for control. The man who was, once adored by millions, had become a curse upon his own empire. The Senate bowed lower. The priests prayed louder. The citizens kept their eyes to the ground. No one dared to speak the truth, that the Emperor of Rome was no longer a man of flesh and blood, but a shadow of insanity ruling through fear. Picture a city that once called itself the heart of civilization, now beating with fear instead of pride. Rome, the empire that had conquered the world, had been conquered by one man's desires. Every command from Caligula was a wound, and every silence from his people was another cut to Rome's soul. The city's marble temples still gleamed under the sun, but their light no longer stood for faith, it stood for fear. The same hands that once built monuments to honor the gods were now forced to serve the madness of one emperor. Caligula grasped something terrifying, that to possess the flesh was to possess the spirit. When he took a man's wife, he took his dignity. When he humiliated a noblewoman, he humiliated her entire household. Each act of cruelty was not only about pleasure but about control. He broke people to remind them that nothing, not love, not family, not faith, could protect them from his will. Rome had crowned a savior, but it had raised a hunter, and now the hunter fed on the very people who once praised his name. Think about the senators who sat in silence as their wives were taken, knowing a single word could end their lives. Think about the mothers who watched their daughters enter the palace and never return the same. Think about the priests who once guarded Rome's temples, now forced to bow to the man who mocked their gods. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were the heartbeat of a dying civilization. The pain of a few had become the shame of millions. Caligula's Rome became a mirror of his corruption. Every family he ruined, every temple he defiled, every vow he shattered reflected the empire's decay. What had once been a city of laws and honor had turned into a playground for humiliation. Marriage, once sacred, became a joke. Religion, once holy, became a mask for fear. And the Senate, once Rome's proud voice, had turned into an audience for his cruelty. Rome's greatness had not been destroyed by enemies from outside its walls. It was consumed from within. The empire's strength, once built on discipline and unity, was replaced by dread and silence. The citizens still marched, still prayed, still pretended that order remained. But beneath the surface, Rome's spirit was bleeding out. Caligula had proven that when one man controls both body and soul, even the strongest empire can collapse without a single sword being raised against it. The streets still echoed with music. The feasts still overflowed with gold, but the joy was gone. The people smiled because they had to, and they cheered because silence was death. Under Caligula's rule, Rome's heart had stopped beating freely. The empire that had once been guided by honor now knelt to appetite. The gods were silent, the people were broken, and the city that once ruled the world had become a monument to its own corruption. Were you aware that Caligula's palace, once a symbol of Rome's divine authority, became a place of shame and corruption? The same marble halls where emperors once planned wars and victories were now filled with whispers, humiliation, and fear. The palace of the Caesars, previously a representation of holy power, turned into a marketplace of dishonor. Caligula's obsession with control spread like a disease, infecting every corner of Roman life. The city that once worshipped its gods now bowed to one man's madness. Religion, once the beating heart of Roman virtue, became his personal stage. Were you aware that Caligula declared himself a living god? He didn't just command soldiers, he demanded prayers. Temples that once honored Jupiter and Mars now displayed statues of Caligula wearing their crowns. Priests, once loyal to the gods, were forced to kneel before him, pretending that his cruelty was divine will. Refusing meant death, and submission meant disgrace. Faith was no longer a matter of devotion, it was survival. Politics offered no safety either. Senators who once debated laws and guided Rome's destiny now competed to flatter their emperor. The Senate chamber, built to symbolize wisdom and justice, became an arena of fear. Were you aware that Caligula mocked senators by taking their wives and parading them in front of the assembly? He reminded them that their titles meant nothing, that their loyalty was only proven by how much humiliation they could endure. Rome's leaders, once the backbone of the Republic, became puppets trembling before their master's cruelty. Marriage, the sacred bond that once united families, turned into a cruel joke under Caligula's rule. Were you aware that he forced husbands to surrender their wives on command? At public feasts, he would point to any woman he desired and take her without shame. The husbands, pale and powerless, were expected to smile as if nothing had happened. The ritual of love and honor that had once bound Rome's families became a tool of the emperor's amusement. Every wedding vow, every promise of fidelity could be erased by his will. Even the sanctuaries of purity were not spared. Were you aware that Caligula violated the Vestal Virgins, the women sworn to protect the sacred fire of Rome? Their purity was meant to guard the empire's soul, but he turned their devotion into tragedy. To destroy the Vestal's vow was to curse the city itself. And yet, Caligula did it openly, as though proving that no god, no oath, and no law could restrain him. Under his rule, horror became normal. What once would have shocked the empire now drew silence. The people of Rome learned to look away, to laugh at cruelty, and to cheer at humiliation. Fear had replaced faith, and obedience had replaced dignity. Caligula's corruption had spread far beyond his palace. It lived inside every citizen forced to pretend that madness was order. The empire that had once ruled the world, through strength and law, was now governed by a single man's appetite. Every institution, religion, politics, and marriage had been stripped of meaning. What was once sacred had been mocked. What was once powerful had been broken. And as Rome's spirit rotted, its people discovered the most terrifying truth of all, that the greatest evil is not always the sword. It is the silence that allows the sword to fall again and again. In the final days of Caligula's reign, the empire was no longer living, it was merely surviving. The people spoke only in whispers. The Senate bowed in fear, and the Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect him, had begun to question what they were defending. The streets of Rome were quiet, but that silence was not peace. It was the silence of exhaustion, of a city crushed under the weight of one man's madness. The laughter that once filled the palace had turned into something hollow, echoing through halls stained by fear. Even those closest to Caligula could no longer hide their hatred. Whispers of rebellion began to grow in secret chambers. The Praetorian Guard, men who had once obeyed every cruel command, now plotted behind the marble walls they once guarded. Senators, humiliated and stripped of dignity, prayed not for Rome's glory, but for Caligula's death. They all knew that if he lived much longer, the empire itself might not. Every citizen, from nobleman to servant, shared one silent wish: to see the emperor fall. The moment finally came on a cold January day in 41 AD. Caligula walked through the palace, drunk on his own delusions of godhood, unaware that the same guards who had once bowed before him now held blades in their hands. The attack was swift and merciless. The man who had turned Rome into a stage of humiliation met the same fate he had dealt to others, betrayed, surrounded, and cut down in the very corridors that had witnessed his cruelty. Blood spread across the marble floor, and with it concluded the rule of the man who had made Rome a brothel of humiliation. Yet his death did not bring peace. The empire could rebuild its buildings, crown a new emperor, and continue its politics, but it could not wash away the stains left on its soul. Rome could advance politically, but emotionally the empire bore the specters of his rule. Families who had been broken could not be mended. Husbands who had bowed to survive could never lift their heads again. The women who had been taken could never forget. The laughter that had once echoed through the city now carried a shadow. Caligula's death was not an ending, it was a warning. Rome had learned how fragile greatness truly was. It had seen that when fear becomes law and power becomes pleasure, even the mightiest empire can rot from within. The people celebrated the tyrant's fall, but deep down they knew the truth. Rome itself had changed. It had looked into the eyes of a monster and found that the monster was not just one man, but the reflection of its own hunger for control. History would remember Caligula as a mad emperor, a man who defiled gods, corrupted laws, and destroyed souls. But his story lives as more than horror. It stands as a mirror for every age that forgets the price of power. The empire that had once ruled the world had been brought to its knees by one man's appetite. And long after his blood dried on the marble, Rome continued to live with the echoes of his madness. History reminds us that the greatest dangers rarely come from outside. They rise from within. Rome did not fall because of an enemy's sword, but because of its own blindness, pride, and silence. Caligula's rule was not only the story of one mad emperor, but the story of a people who allowed fear to replace honor. They bowed to survive, they obeyed to live, and in doing so they gave him the power to destroy them. The empire that had once conquered the world could not defend itself from the corruption of its own heart. When power becomes divine, mercy dies. When rulers believe they are gods, the people become sacrifices. Caligula believed he was immortal, above judgment, untouchable by any law. But history shows that even the most powerful fall, and when they do, their fall shakes the world they built. His death came not by armies or rebellions, but by those who had once sworn loyalty to him. It was not a war that ended his reign. It was conscience, finally awakened. The mightiest empires do not always collapse to foreign blades. Sometimes they decay from the inside, consumed by the hungers of those crowned as deities. Rome had been built on discipline, honor, and faith, yet it crumbled under indulgence, vanity, and silence. Every cruelty Caligula committed was another crack in the foundation of the empire. And when the marble finally broke, it revealed the truth. No nation, no kingdom, no empire can survive when humanity itself becomes a tool of power. Caligula's story is more than a tale of madness. It is a warning carved in stone. Power without restraint becomes destruction. Worship without truth becomes slavery. Rome believed it could grant divinity to a man, but in doing so, it turned itself into his offering. The echoes of that mistake still whisper through history, reminding us that tyranny begins not with the rise of a monster, but with the silence of those who choose to look away.